Welcome to the Einstein Forum. I am not Omri Bohm, who had intended to moderate and host this talk. Omri threw his back out this morning and had to cancel. He will be listening from his bed. He can't sit up at the moment. It happens to people. But I was most happy to spring in and welcome Benjamin Zachariah again to the Einstein Forum. It's actually pretty rare that we invite someone so quickly again, who we hosted a year ago. But we were incredibly impressed by Ben's talk last year on fascism in contemporary India. And when I mentioned to the team that I was very interested in the question, how can one be anti-colonialist without signing on to post-colonial theory, which is something that I have a number of problems with, Misha Gabovich suggested, well, why don't we invite Ben? He's been working on that. And I said, wonderful. And then he came back with a title that was even stronger than the one that I had initially proposed, which was something like Anti-colonialism without post-colonial theory. He came up with the title Anti-colonialism against post-colonial theory. So I'm extremely happy to welcome him, looking forward to this talk, which is the first contribution of the Einstein Forum to the series that is currently being offered by the initiative Weltoffenheit. Ben Zachariah studied history and philosophy at Presidency College in Calcutta and Trinity College, Cambridge, where he earned a PhD in the history of developmental thought. He's now working on comparative fascisms and on the politics of history writing. And he told me he's moving from history into public activism, since history, he says, has lost confidence in its ability to deliver anything relevant. Welcome, Ben. Oh, let me make one, although many of our regular listeners will know this already. Ben will speak for about 45 minutes, after which I will be able to ask him a few questions, and then all of you are invited to use the Q&A or F&A function in your Zoom screen and ask anything you would like. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation as well. It's rare that one is allowed to speak on such a subject as post-colonial theory and anti-colonialism. It's also been pointed out to me that today is Lenin's birthday. And so before I get labeled as an old communist, let me make the standard disclaimer. I am not now, nor have I ever been a member of the Communist Party. However, as you will see, there are sides of the way I have been trained to think, which find the forms of exceptionalism that come into our thinking nowadays very difficult. And I think the bridge between what I said the last time I was invited to the Einstein Forum and this one is the fact that when you said to post-colonial theorists that there is a fascist wave in the world and India is part of it, they'd say, oh no, India is different. You'd say, how is it different? We don't know what it's different from, but it's different. Now, since I no longer count myself as a historian of India, although I continue to work in some aspects on that, this may not matter because I might actually be one of the persons who might agree that it is different and know what it is different from, because comparisons tend to fail if you don't know what you're comparing it with. But the exceptionalism on the moment notwithstanding, I thought I'd try to bring us into this conversation by going back to the abstract that I pointed to, and then trying to elaborate on some aspects of that. I think you'll all have read the abstract by now. Hopefully that's why you turned up. In some respects, post-colonial theory is the most successful product of academia, but it has transcended its origins in universities and literary criticism. It has become a way of acknowledging the subjectivities of historically victimized communities in public policy and political activity. That is, I think, quite basic. And from here on is what I want to argue. With this success has come the trend that political activity operates on the basis of clumsy victimhood analogies and reified communities. And much of its rhetoric is deliberately anti-rational, even reproducing and perpetuating the manufactured categories of racist and sectarian imaginations, even if the category is moved from a negative to a positive connotation. Meanwhile, there has been a marked rise in arguments that work at an ad hominem level. One can or cannot say certain things based on who one is. This is the point at which I'm supposed to tell you my family history, but I won't yet. Given that there is currently a strong right-wing assault on post-colonial ideas as allegedly ultra-left, even as right-wing public rhetoric reproduces some of the same themes, what is the future of anti-colonialism in the face of post-colonialism? If we do not think in terms of some claims, us to people who are not us, do we have any claims upon anybody else? And so, of course, the answer of the post-colonialists to this used to be a gesture towards co-victimhoods across the world, and I would like to suggest that this is slightly inadequate for the task. I think by now, I'll have to make it clear to you that A, I'm not an apologist for right-wing white supremacist organizations, though in some cases, when I make an argument in public, I have been referred to as white. B, I have enough victimhood points to give this talk without being suspected of being a white supremacist. But that doesn't always work because I could be a self-hating choose your category here. And I shall attempt not to caricature the arguments I oppose, but that isn't made easier by the fact that those who make these arguments do a pretty good job of caricaturing themselves, appearing on Facebook and Twitter with soundbite self-righteousness at their fingertips, and mostly bullying younger and often white and well-meaning colleagues into submission. The dilemma here, of course, is that these arguments, and increasingly the people who make them, are considered the flag bearers of the left. And as the argument now goes, breaking ranks with them makes you suspected of being a right-winger because increasingly there is no room for subtleties of positions. Any argument that cannot be presented as a tweet stands no chance of success. And alongside that, the level of argumentation amounts very often to the find one thing to say about the speaker or writer that will morally outrage an audience, and you have won the argument. But arguments are notorious for hanging in the air without the speakers or writers who use them, whether these speakers or writers originally made them up or not. This, I think, is the ad hominem problem that I've been talking about. We need to deal with the inconvenient arguments that make their appearance, regardless of the speaking voice or the intention of the speaker, in as much as one can read intention anyway. The argument cannot depend on whether the messenger in a particular case suits the audience's moral prejudices. I think many people, including myself, have made the point that much of this is very bad intellectual practice, but it's worse politics. So what I think we have come to now in political debate, which purports to be about some form of social justice, is that we have predefined victim and perpetrator communities. Like the ideal situation is if you wish to be identified as a perpetrator community, it helps to be German because, as we know, it's the world championship of evil that they have won several times round. And victim communities, there again, it helps to be a person of color. It's only victims who have speaking rights. Perpetrators must be silent, or they may be supportive, therefore, within quotes, allies. I don't think the world divides so easily. The dominant mode of argumentation is emotion and not rationality. And as a historian of fascism, you're always a little worried when the emotional argument dominates and the rational argument takes a back seat, that the left as well as the right, or people who consider themselves left and right, I will come to why I don't think this is a good distinction anymore, are prone to moral panics and to make arguments from a quasi-religious position of the purity of conscience. The wider context of the emergence of post-colonialism as a set of positions is something I have spent time on. First in a volume called The Sage Handbook of Historical Theory, and then in a book called After the Last Post. Having represented the post-colonialists with respect for their positions and having given them a coherence that they are not always able to give to themselves, can the subalternist communicate? I shall now proceed to draw only on the points that explain why it is a dead end. Briefly, the importance of breaking down the apparently self-evident dominant perspective of a ruling class or elite required a focus on subjectivities. But we now have subjectivities for their own sake, and individuals are supposed to line up in their pre-given and often a priori subjectivities and represent themselves from within their cultures. This fixes cultures and values within a disciplined community. Dissent from within is frowned upon as a betrayal of sorts. Dissenters are faced with what I can only describe as a sort of caste committee that prescribes proper norms of behavior and punishes with social boycotts those who don't follow the norms. Now this, to really understand how this works, you have to understand the deep implication in, shall we say, Indian discursive formations that is post-colonial studies. And of course, this is not legible to a great number of people who are to be spoken at, though not necessarily to. And it's not legible to a number of people for whom the arguments are performed, because after all, the performance of the argument is to represent the post-colonial world to the post-colonizer, if you like. Now, these terms, however problematizing they seem and however problematized they seem to have a long survival mode. So we are trapped in this relentless theatrical production of performing some kind of person of color post-justification before a world which is not interested. Now, in the old-fashioned anti-colonial way, one would say, why are we speaking to the right? These are not our interlocutors, right? And I don't think that the ways in which post-colonialism speaks to what they often unproblematically describe as the West, the global North, or the white world, and in private they get much more insulting. None of these categories really stand up very well. I think the difficulty, of course, is that mostly when you speak at this global North, what you're doing is you are performing to an already guilty white audience, and therefore you are preaching to the converted. And they're much more likely to stand up and applaud and then come up with a position of their own, which is variously described, but one of the terms that I'm particularly allergic to is critical whiteness. If whiteness were that critical, it should have died by now, but it hasn't. Now, when I said caste boycott, I think what I had in mind, and I think this will keep coming back, is the fact that post-colonial theorists form a caste unto themselves. Now, of course, there's a hierarchy of that. There are the first generation for whom it was a good time to be brown in the 80s and 90s, because that was when, in particular, the United States Academy was appointing minorities. And whereas they had a reasonably good understanding of politics at home, I like to think, they simply incorporated the politics of elsewhere by making certain strategic appointments. Now, these individuals have spent the rest of their life kicking away the ladder for junior scholars and making sure that they demand obeisance and hierarchy and rank. And there's an interesting shift there in which the subalternist stands for the subaltern. And within the academy performs this act of ventriloquism where they speak for the downtrodden and therefore wish to be considered downtrodden themselves, which is kind of awkward. Now, again, following on from the question of the caste boycott analogy, since the individual is considered one of the Enlightenment myths that is European and Eurocentric, the loss of individual rights to dissent is never problematized. And of course, as I've argued elsewhere, this leads to a kind of knee-jerk nationalism among post-colonial intellectuals, which I don't think by any stretch of imagination can be considered progressive, regardless of how one wishes to position oneself. I think another point I'd like to place before you for consideration now is this. Post-colonial theory has supposedly contributed to something that we are now calling the identitarian left, mostly as a term of disdain among other leftists, and you can hear it in my presentation as well. But I don't think the term should be used at all. Identitarian arguments are neither left nor right. They fit very well into white supremacist frames as well. And the tricky part of this seems to be that an identity that wishes to be legitimate must also make a victimhood claim. If a group can make a plausible claim internally among people who are more or less already convinced that they are now a victim group, they can then work up the moral outrage necessary to organize and mobilize as an identity. So after all, in the 1990s, when Samuel Huntington produced his understanding of the clash of civilizations, Western civ was not presented as a universal truth supported by Enlightenment rationality. It was in structure a post-colonial argument about defending our culture against encroachments from people who don't like our values. I don't really see any difference between that and post-colonial culturalism or complaints about cultural appropriation in a different sense. And maybe this needs some elaboration, because I think the central point I'd like to make is, say, when the subjectivization of historical narrative, for instance, proceeded, which started reasonably early. The history from below movements were 1950s and 60s movements. The argument was to suggest that the so-called dominant voice is in fact a very partial narrative. Now, when you get to the point where the subjectivity is supposed to be the only thing you know, and when the historian becomes the partisan for a subjectivity and is no longer a historian, but then is supposedly a spokesman for an entire culture or a nation, then we're going in a very awkward direction. And I want to say that the only thing which makes some identities not legitimate and some identities legitimate in a world of competing identities is the victimhood claim. Now, this victimhood claim is made quite explicit in the arguments that happened in the 90s about whether a kind of post-colonial claim could reach out across the specificities of one cultural domain. And we know how using post-colonial ideas tends to reify one set of ideas. I thought at one point that one should try to reduce the observations on post-colonialism to a set of theses. And since post-colonialism is supposed to be an improvement on Karl Marx, I thought we should have 12 theses on post-colonialism, not 11. But we need not concern with all of them today. So I'll read you 1 to 4 and 6 to 8, which I think are relevant to our talk today. 1 says, there is but one universal truth about universal human rights. The only universal right is the right to be offended. Outrage is the preferred mode of expression of this right. The second is ad hominem is a methodology, not a fallacy. So the third is superstition is tradition. Tradition is science. Science is superstition. And if this seems confusing, call them science 1 and science 2. 4, it is important to say with enormous authority that we have no authority, which then itself is the source of our authority. 6, gender, like race, is both a construct and an essence, sometimes at one and the same time, for one and the same reason, sometimes at one or the other time for one or the other instrumental reason. 7, the individual is an Enlightenment conspiracy, but everyone has agency as long as they're contained within family, community, and nation. 8, the age of reason is the age of empire. To be reasonable, therefore, is to collude with imperialism and therefore with all forms of oppression. Now, obviously, caricature is a favored mode of political polemic. It's not necessarily a favored form of intellectual debate. But as I've said already, they do a good job of caricaturing themselves as well. Academically now, and these are the gains of post-colonial theory, there's a growing tendency for certain fields to be dominated by people of color, and there's a strong tendency to self-censorship on the part of white academics who are involved in these fields. In the US, colleagues are now worried that as post-colonialism or post-colonial studies or Black or Chicano or Jewish studies becomes the preserve of eponymous minorities, American history, or the so-called mainstream American history as it now comes to be called, has become white studies. And whiteness is being undifferentiatedly placed in a box. Now, the argument for this is quite simple. If you are making a kind of offbeat argument about the place of minorities within a political order, and there's a minority studies entity, and you are already saying that there should or need be no communication across these segmentary boundaries, then everybody simply pulls in the drawbridge and makes their own little field, which doesn't even need to be internally consistent, though it helps if it is. And so nobody listens to anybody else, and everybody lives on in their self-perpetuating myths. And what's even weirder about this is that self-perpetuating myths were considered the hallmark of ignorance. Self-perpetuating myths today are the heart of academic discussion. You cannot get out of your own circle. Whiteness being undifferentiatedly placed in a box means that the Irish or the Jews are undifferentiatedly white, which historically they have not always been. There is also now a tendency to demand theorists from the global south to study subjects that deal with the global south. When does the geographical origin of a scholar determine whether that theory is relevant for a particular problem? By the way, I imagine that the Nazis, among others, would be quite pleased that the ancient Greeks are now undoubtedly white. It is, of course, true that a self-proclaimed Western intellectual tradition has been dominant in a great deal of academic and political life. But when some academics were saying that Black or Asian scholarship had historically been underrated or ignored, I very much doubt that they were saying that every book written by a Black or Asian writer in the times that they had been most ignored should be greeted with a sense of wonder. After all, no one said that Black and Asian writers couldn't read or write. merely that what they wrote was not read. Is this not reproducing the initial problem? So now I think we're beginning to be in a world where I'm trying to pull at the edges of the implications of certain arguments. And I'm not pulling very hard, but I believe that the thread is coming apart reasonably easily in my reading. I'm sure other people would disagree. Now, in the situation where certain arguments are protected and preserved, because that protecting and preserving argument is because it's not my business to intervene in somebody else's cultural debate. We are no longer in a world where we're actually creating situations of open debate. So of course, the liberal left dilemma was always to tolerate intolerance in the name of tolerance. And I'm beginning to think of this in terms of an existential crisis, as more and more left liberals are keen to understand hurt sentiments. They're less keen to understand the dangers of those with hurt sentiments resorting to forms of violence. Those of us who live as visibly brown and black people in white majority societies are faced with actual or potential violence, also from fellow brown or black people, with whom we are, of course, lumped in the imagination of white liberal leftists who then wish to protect our sentiments. And while it may be a theoretical position for many well-meaning white left liberals to suggest that sentiments should stay unhurt, there is much brown on brown and black on black violence that happens because non-conformity is rewarded, sometimes with death and destruction. Whose problem is this? When you go back to the founding texts of post-colonial studies, one thing that is remarkable is the word innocence. Ashish Nandi opens a book with the statement that he wishes to speak for the innocence of the colonized. There is a longish debate that appears in Indian post-colonial studies a lot. And it takes an initial debate about the validity of the, shall we say, assisted suicide of the widow on the funeral pyre of her husband, and suggests that the issue is not whether women were in fact voluntarily or involuntarily being killed, but whether the colonial project, which claimed to be more civilized than the natives, was in fact able to claim this. Now, to my mind, this might be a footnote on page 5, but when it becomes the main story, we are losing something of the dimensions of a problem. And we are being fed ahistorical fables. There's another problem, which is the inability to gauge audience, rhetoric, and register among many post-colonial writers. For one of the examples that always struck me was Chinua Achebe's outrage at Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, which appears to show disrespect to Africans in his rhetoric. And Achebe makes no attempt to actually situate the rhetoric of Conrad in terms of who Conrad was writing for. But if Jomo Kenyatta provides an elaborate defense of female genital mutilation, which he does in a whole chapter in Facing Mount Kenya, which I read again today, forward by Malinowski. Do we politely look away because we're not of his culture? Are Bangladeshi bloggers who have fled for their lives to Germany after the brutal hacking to death of their friends who dared to express atheist sentiments now to be assailed by well-meaning critically white people who call them Islamophobic? Meanwhile, does this actually empower any of those whose subjectivities are being defended? In any case, is academic practice an appropriate site to empower anyone? Or does it empower by proxy those who speak for the apparently disempowered in an act of ventriloquism? I despair for a minority that resolutely insists on remaining a minority, while the alleged inheritors of privilege repeatedly and resoundingly abused for what their ancestors did, retreat to their privileges and leave the minorities to their sanctimonious suffering. Let's try to be more specific. The rule of law often doesn't function at all for minorities. In Germany, there was a strong set of debates around the murders by the National Socialist underground and the trials that followed. There's a very strong case for showing that, as is the case of the infiltration or collaboration of police and army with right-wing and fascist groups. But the existence of a principle to appeal to is important because it is the basis of state legitimacy and can therefore be appealed to. So it wouldn't, for instance, be possible to suggest that the infiltration of police and army by fascists is actually not something to be concerned about, because there is a principle of a principle at stake behind it. So one can complain precisely because there is a principle to adhere to. In the country I was born in, there is no longer any such thing, which is not to say that there never was. But the trend towards identitarian politics, kangaroo social media courts, and forced conformity with both progressive and increasingly fascist norms leaves no room for differentiated views. Also, if you don't believe you have anything in common with those upon whom you are making a claim, in this case, upon the dominant society, principles you share, especially the operative principles upon which you make that claim, well, you don't have a claim. Because your subjectivity is not their subjectivity and you have no call upon it. Which I think is the operative point. It's irrelevant whether an author and I agree or disagree. What we need to share is a willingness to debate on the basis of reason, not of victimhood claims. Or why does a Brahmin get to be an apologist for caste as something more complex than a critic of caste? Are we scholars, or do I have to take my trousers down to answer whether I'm qualified to speak? Some time ago in a letter I signed about freedom of academic practice, there's a part in that letter which talks about the need to boldly and unapologetically safeguard critical thinking based on evidence. And then it links out to an argument about the rights war on university. Now, I think the war on critical thinking is carried on much more efficiently by post-colonial victimhood studies, so why just blame the right? There are certain things that can no longer be discussed in public. A form of anti-rationalism has come to the fore as we have privileged affect over reason. More recently, there was this experiment that somebody conducted on social media. A quote attributed to Zizek said, "No, post-colonial studies is just a bunch of rich Indians having a good time," or something to that effect. Now, apparently he had said something similar at some point, but somebody else tried the same trick without naming Zizek. And everybody was perfectly satisfied with the statement. Some people agreed, some people qualified it. But when it was attributed to Zizek, it was simply considered an outrageous statement by a white man. Now, I think we're beginning to see that shooting the messenger is a favored form of argument. It could well be that Zizek didn't actually decide that this was his own view based on his own research. It could well have been an opinion he formed by reading other people's writing. Whether that argument, however truncated as an argument it is, or is valid or not, cannot really depend on whether you like Zizek. But that's where we're going. I think that at this point, we've got to the stage where I've outlined what I think is a series of fragmentary vignettes which bring you back to forms of reasoning which nobody really thinks are really forms of reasoning, but which have become the sacred cows of academic discourse, and in doing so have also become the sacred cows of public discourse. everybody is very careful about not seeming to say something that might appear to some people to be morally suspect, in some views racist. Definitely, there is safety in taking a view that is the consensus. Now, in academic practice, this basically becomes an inability to get anything published that is actually going against an established consensus. And there's a whole subplot to all of this, which can be worked out in this way. It's the fact that we are now imposing conformity in those aspects of social life which are supposed to generate new knowledge. And that's the point at which I think it's time for many of us to leave the academy. Or at best, because many of us still have to earn a living somehow, to have a foot in the academy and try to make some money from it, but also to try and get on with doing something more sincerely and directly politically relevant. Which brings me to the question of anti-colonialism. Now, I don't believe that the only anti-colonial people were those who somehow by virtue of Blut und Boden belonged to some kind of oppressed nation. I also think that the concept of the nation has been less than freeing. If you have a right to self-determination, why does the self always have to be collectively expressed? And here we're in an interesting polemic, which to my shorthand thinking involves three people centrally: Rosa Luxemburg, Lenin, and a man called M.N. Roy. So everybody reads Lenin's polemic against Luxemburg and suggests that the right to self-determination is that which every communist must give. And Luxemburg differentiates between what she thinks is a progressive collective and what she thinks is not. Lenin does not. At the Second Comintern Congress, Lenin proposes that national liberation movements be supported across the world. And the challenge to him comes from a man at the time representing the Communist Party of Mexico, but who's actually a Bengali who, by a strange set of circumstances, ends up in Mexico. And M.N. Roy makes a point which I think is quite similar to Rosa Luxemburg and says, no, not every national liberation movement is worth supporting. And I want to take a step back and suggest that anti-colonialism was never always already a nationalism. But you wouldn't guess that from post-colonial studies. You would think that everybody's already lined up in the kind of Kenyatta way. Kenyatta's villains are what he calls a detribalized people. Kenyatta has an entire chapter saying, well, you know, all these enlightened Africans who go around marrying uncircumcised women, they'll never be accepted in their own community. And that's the point, that you have to be accepted in your own community. Now, it used to be considered reasonably commonplace to suggest that two opposing ideologies are neither necessarily good nor bad, that this is not a Manichaean world of the good and the bad that are in conflict and that you have to choose one against the other. In a similar vein, it used to be normal not to consider every collectivity that came from an oppressed part of the world as automatically worthy of defending. that certain questions ought not to be asked too loudly, certain things ought not to be said in public, because your job was to support a certain position. Now, obviously, there's a long-standing Comintern style Marxism that suggested that nations must be self-determined before they can proceed to the next stage, which is socialism. And so, in practice, a number of left progressives associated with communist parties have been nationalists. Famously, Jawaharlal Nehru in New York in 1948 suggested to the Americans that they support the Chinese Communist Revolution. And he said there's a very simple reason for that. These are not really communists, these are nationalists. They're Asian nationalists. And if you recognize that, you don't throw them into the hands of the communist bloc. Now, he didn't find very many takers for this argument. But these were forms of thinking that were not uncommon. The idea that you did not have to take a moral position along with your subject, and that you did not have to identify so strongly with a group that your voice could not be distinguished from the group. And I don't really think that were you to accuse any really existing post-colonial scholar of any of these things, that they would accept it. I hope at least that they would wriggle. But I do now study comparative fascism, and I have been working on the problems with an emerging Indian fascism for a long time. The fascists in India continuously attack history and historians, but they have never attacked the mainstream of post-colonial scholarship. And I would submit that it's the same damn thing. There's the same kind of knee-jerk culturalism. There's the same defensive reaction to any so-called external critique. The argument is not important, it's the person that's important. And here's where I probably need to say that as a very small minority in India, I probably never had the option to line up in one or the other gang. And so possibly mine is also an identitarian argument, if you want to see it that way. I think I've gone to my 45 minutes, so I'll stop here. Your mic's not on.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. I love your talk. Many things about it. Let me start with one. It was also very funny in rather subtle ways. So let me start with one of the funnier remarks you made. It was just an aside. You asked if the subaltern can communicate. Mm-hmm. Do you have an explanation of why so many post-colonialist texts are written in such a way that it would actually be impossible for any but a very small circle of people, or someone who's willing to do an awful lot of work to enter them, to understand them? And whether that's tied with the remarks that you were making about reason. Because it's funny, of course, it's not just affect. If you read some of these standard texts, yes, they're appealing to affect, but they are also virtually unable to communicate. And if you can spend a lot of time on a page of theory and realize that it boils down to, 2.5 sentences worth of claims, which are put in, let's say, an extraordinarily obscure way. How are the medium and the message connected?
I think there's an emperor's new clothes problem there. I think they were very aware that what they were saying was ultimately not terribly clever. I mean, I think that the germs of what they were saying were available in many other forms before and in less identitarian ways. In other words, it was not necessarily that particular voice that you needed. I mean, it's also disingenuous, right? When you claim to be giving the downtrodden back their voices, but you're saying that that voice must be my voice because I'm the only one who can speak for those who cannot speak. Gayatri Spivak even quotes Marx: Sie können sich nicht vertreten, sie müssen vertreten werden. And you do actually get some very elitist claims masquerading as liberational arguments. We don't want to go into the slips where people actually talk about their subalterns or their Dalits. Yeah. But I think the disjuncture is also because, well, I don't want to read intention. I don't think you can read intention, but I certainly think that there seems to be a kind of sense of an inferiority complex. If you look at the debates that that were actually happening after the first few volumes of Subaltern Studies came out, where people, there was one set of people saying you don't have enough sources for a proper history from below. This was partially answered. And there was another group of people saying you're under-theorized. Now, the thing that tended to happen was they went for more theory. And they didn't actually address the question of what was our initial project, which was in fact a late wave of history from below. But then it became more and more bad literary criticism.
Let me, that's helpful. Let me put my cards on the table. I have been working recently on the very standard post-colonialist claim, which mentioned the age of reason was the age of empire, and therefore anything in particular connected with the Enlightenment is colonialist, racist, and reactionary. And in order to try and refute those claims, I recently had occasion to read quite a lot of texts of Diderot's that I did not know, and that I reread some Fanon. And I swear that actually Diderot is more strongly anti-colonialist than Fanon is, but you could sign some of these quotes, Frantz Fanon, and the others as Denise Diderot, and you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. So one of the things that I'm trying to figure out is how the greatest critics of colonialism, I mean, colonialism was not invented in the 18th century. It has, of course, a very long tradition. What the 18th century did was not across the board by any means, but the 18th century's greatest thinkers produced arguments against colonialism, and not simply against certain brutalities within colonialism. I mean, that you have with De las Casas and people like that, but actually structurally reasoned arguments why colonialism was morally wrong, which you had from people like Rousseau and Diderot and Kant and others. I am extremely puzzled about how that got turned around. It is almost as if I have the feeling when I'm reading some of the post-colonial attacks on the Enlightenment that up is down and down,
They haven't read any of this stuff. I mean, I would be willing to listen to somebody who actually did a close reading of a text and explain. I mean, there's a David Harvey article on Kant's geographies, which shows how Kant's cosmopolitanism didn't translate very well into his understanding of non-Western societies. And in other words, he was a racist. But that's actually something that works because he's reading the text, not because he's decided that the Enlightenment is this meta category that is wrong. I mean, I went to a talk in Leipzig by a colleague who was arguing something about the Enlightenment, and he was denounced as a Eurocentrist, but all his material was from the Persianate world. And he said, hey, hang on, did I tell you that what I'm talking about is Europe? I'm not. And in fact, what's interesting about a number of the Enlightenment polemics is that they deal precisely with a land somewhere else where things are more rational and well organized. And this land somewhere else is usually Persia.
Oh, there's several others. I mean, the Enlightenment invented the concept of Eurocentrism as a problem.
Yeah.
They talk about China, they talk about the Persians, they talk about Tahiti. They talk about Native American communities. So, and it's not all just fantasy. Some of it is quite empirically, I mean, as good as one could empirically ground things in an age where, transportation was a different story. So it's almost this inversion, the idea that the Enlightenment was Eurocentric, when the Enlightenment invented the very idea that Europe needed to listen to other cultures to, as you say, become more rational. You think it's just a claim that got started without anybody reading the relevant books?
I mean, I think what tends to be said is that the promise of the Enlightenment is never actually matched by the realities that proceeded after that, which is in fact the Enlightenment's critique of itself as well. So I don't understand why that makes it a particular problematic thing. But from there to this kind of Enlightenment as the fake promise of rationality, which nobody actually has, you have two choices. You could therefore say, well, the forms of liberation that were offered were not realized, therefore liberation is fake and we don't want it. Or you can say it wasn't then realizable, but we should therefore proceed to think about it. And possibly, I mean, there's this phrase of E.P. Thompson's which keeps coming back, the enormous condescension of posterity. And I think that this is one of the huge problems of a lot of writing, which argues from a present day moral position back into the past. I mean, it's a very simple principle that we were taught as young historians, that your analytic is not necessarily an actor-centric view. But that even if you wish to judge a pre-existing society according to your analytic, it doesn't make a lot of sense to insist that they both be identical. And I mean, I think that the strange part of what post-colonial studies has done is that almost the only relevant fact about any society is colonialism.
Can I jump in, Susan and Ben?
Yes, of course.
I'm trying to jump in without opening the video. As Susan especially would know, but not only Susan, I'm not averse to defending Enlightenment, rationality, and reason. Far from it. But it's a good, reason to play a devil's advocate, because I think that there is an elephant in the room when we're making those claims, and it's a question of what is reason and what are the grounds of reason. Can we still maintain a good old Enlightenment notion of rationality as somehow opposed to say post-colonialist or anti-colonialist trends? And the question can be framed perhaps as the following. There was a moment in the Enlightenment movement when there was an attempt to defend the ability of reason to set moral ends and to, in that sense, be truly universal.
Mm-hmm.
However, it's not obviously successful rationally. And we'll be back in the question if we would think it's not important, right? Because if we do believe in reason, then that argument actually has to go through in order to convince. I personally, do a lot in order to try to defend it. But historically, it hasn't obviously been successful. For example, immediately after Darwin, it makes much more sense to think of reason in much more instrumental sense. Post-metaphysical rationality often has a danger of sliding precisely into the notion of self-interest as being the guide of reason, rather than, say, a certain notion of justice that can be absolutely binding. Now, if that's your concept of what reason is, and let's say enlightened tolerance or enlightened interest takes a front seat with your notion of what reason is, then it very quickly slips into being an ideology for, let's call it metaphorically, white men. Now, do we have a viable notion of reason that does not go to self-interest, that does not go back to a certain notion of we, those who already belong, define the norms, a certain pragmatist, say, notion of reason? And if we don't, what are we to do about that?
I mean, my response to that is the ends of reason, the way you described it, would be different for different users of a set of norms. But the counter question to that is, does anybody else get to use the same norms? And in using those norms, who are they addressing? So obviously you can, I have this idea of different languages of legitimation, that you can in fact argue at several levels about the same problem. And depending on who you're addressing and what norm you wish to appeal to, you would be tailoring your argument to a certain set of legitimating principles. So you would appeal to an absolutist monarch in a certain way, but you would equally, and the same people might be at the same time appealing to a democratic format at the same time. So even if reason as we know it has served one set of people, it doesn't follow that it will always serve the same set of people, and turning rationality against its previous conclusions has been something that political thinkers have been remarkably good at.
Thank you. That may also be an answer. We have a question here. Thank you for the fantastic talk. Question, what we need to share is a debate based on reason. How does one reason when the premise of reason itself is considered not valid anymore? Of course, one can say considered by whom. But Ben, do you want to respond to that along with your response to Omri?
I think they go well together. I think part of what we've been saying now is that we don't think that there's one form of reason. That reason is a normative positive for most people. So even those who might be accused of making emotional or affective arguments rather than rational arguments would not be very happy to concede the point. So, I mean, I think what matters is that the grounds of an argument keep shifting as you have them, and that makes it difficult to have. But the idea that one must try to communicate across boundaries of specificities is more or less what I have in mind when I think of rational communication, where you do not a priori exclude one side by attributing to that side certain particularities that disqualify them from communication.
Ben, can I try to push you on that? Or Susan can stop me if she wants.
No, go ahead, push.
I mean, we shouldn't be debating now really hardcore philosophy for seminar room questions, but it seems to me when your answer becomes there are different types of reasons,
Mm-hmm.
then in a certain way, we're just with the same problem back in the back door, right? Because I'm all for the translation or the translatability of different reasons, but this assumes then in some sense one reason, which is universal, right? So the possibility of translation would assume, without denying different maybe forms of rationality, if they can be translated and be understood by one another, then they assume a certain universal notion of reason. The question is whether that is something that can still be defended. My position would be, by all means, we should defend it, but it's not easy. And it's not obvious that what people call today reason successfully did that.
Well, I think I wouldn't go so far as to say that there must be some form of reason which is universal to bind other forms of reason together. But I would say that there would be an attempt to intersubjectively reason. It's not necessarily that we are always successful. It may be that the premises we have don't fully map onto somebody else's premises, that the translation is not always effective. But I mean, I think the difficulty I have is that the attempt is not made, rather than the attempt is made to the point of failure. I don't know if this is a very effective answer. And I think philosophically it's dissatisfying because I don't think you can test this without having tried to reason.
No, I agree about that, just to be sure. I mean, I agree that the question is whether we ought to try to do this and then fail or not, or whether we ought, or whether we're trying to actually prove the opposite. But it's just not easily can be assumed. But
I want to get at some similar questions through a slightly different angle. You began by assuring us that you were not now, nor have you ever been, a member of the Communist Party. But as I understand you, you're situating yourself on the left. And is that correct, first of all? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, that's what I thought, because, you know, there are people at the moment in and outside the academy who simply would like us to return, and critics of post-colonial theory, critical race studies, who, you know, think if everybody just stopped being ad hominem and returned to some conception of reason, we would all be much better off. And I take it you're saying something much stronger than that. I don't have to name the middle of the road people who publish those kinds of arguments. You're saying that post-colonial studies are themselves not left.
They're not there. No,
yeah,
not
I agree with you entirely. And let me just say why I think that's true. It seems to me that if there's one thing that one can identify as being left, it's the idea that we have or can have deep connections and responsibilities towards people who are not part of our own tribe, whereas the right is always fundamentally tribal, always assumes that you cannot have real community and connection except with people who share your tribe, and you therefore also have very few responsibilities towards people who don't. So for me, it's fundamentally part of being left to say, no, our connections and our responsibilities go beyond our particular tribes. Now, that's what I grew up with. And I grew up in the American South, so that the civil rights movement and African-American history was the part of this story that I know the best. And it was considered left or progressive to insist, for example, that African-American history is part of American history, and it shouldn't be shunted off to you know, African American studies or the province of only Black people. So my question is, because you are a historian and I'm not, though I do read quite a lot of history, do you have an idea of what transformation occurred from the point where standing left was fundamentally to be in defense of universalism, and to the point where universalism itself, like the Enlightenment, like all kinds of things, but just let's leave the Enlightenment aside, just talk about universalism, where that became, you know, the problem, and being left meant something entirely different from what it meant, let's say, 40 years ago. Do you have a historical explanation of what happened?
I mean, I think that part of it came from political movements which met with frustrations as they tried to bring more people into understanding each other's subjectivities. And I think that, I mean, I think a lot of these movements then retreated into the academy and then became a sort of received wisdom in the academy. And from the other side, the new entrants got this kind of separatism fed at them. In part, I guess there's also this tendency towards ultra specialization and everybody making up their own languages and forming their own communities that are sealed off to one another. I don't think we could find an explanation only in politics or only in the academy. But I think what's interesting is that that there seemed to be a moment where this frustration with trying to bridge subjectivities then turned into a refusal to try and bridge them anymore.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we've got lots of questions here. Let me just take them as they came. This is from Jungmok Yi. I think you've addressed and expressed many ideas and thoughts that is impossible to go over within 45 minutes. What are your thoughts on the phenomenon of globalization and contemporary influences of social media, and thinking of post-colonialism versus anti-colonialism?
I mean, I think in part, forms of communication have been globalized. I don't think that a kind of meaningful bringing together of the world has actually happened. The inequalities have remained, but they seem to be expressed in the same way. There is a kind of hegemony of social media forms of communication, which I think I referred to. I think it has led to a further dumbing down of a lot of communication, because, as I said, you have to be very crisp and quick. And whereas earlier, if you had to publish a pamphlet, 3 or 4 people had to get the money together, and you had to proofread it and find somebody to do the messy job of printing or cyclostyling. Now you just put it on social media. So the things have speeded up. I don't know whether the fact that social media specializes in your building your own community of the like-minded actually has made it easier to simply talk to your own closed circle. But post-colonial studies predates social media, and they seem to do this quite effectively without Twitter and Facebook, although I dare say they feel more productive now that they have Twitter and Facebook.
Okay, I'm just going to try and get to everyone. I'm not sure this is a question. It's a quote from Johannes Riedner. In weltbürgerlicher Absicht, is it enough? Can we pursue? Do you want to comment on that quote?
I'm not very sure of wanting to create still larger categories as oppositions to categories that are already too big to be useful. But I definitely think that trying to find positions that don't keep taking you back into your ghetto are really worth doing. That's the minimum I think we need to do, because we are actually in a field of communication which claims to be social scientific, it claims to be politically engaged, and so on.
Okay, here's someone who wants to remain anonymous. Much of what you have said about post-colonial thought has also been said of critical race theory, i.e. that they're both forms of the short-circuiting of thought in favor of a pre-approved explanation of the facts in question. Their prevalence is also heavily bound up with a generational shift in the academy. It appears that an entire generation of scholars and young people in the humanities and softer social sciences has been schooled in forms of thought that are forms of not thinking. Is that an overstatement of the situation?
Yes, probably a little, but I think it gets near to a situation where within your community, what counts as a way of thinking is not really open to challenges from outside, because the training is not to accept challenges from outside, it's almost to a priori separate them out. So rather than not thinking, I would suggest that there's a form of the reproduction of comforting shibboleths. And that happens a lot in any self-contained field. I mean, it would happen in post-colonial studies, but I'm quite sure that there are various white supremacist groups who are perfectly capable of producing these self-contained fields as well. But we don't expect to talk to them. Whereas if we feel that we are on the side of social justice, we do expect to talk across boundaries.
Here's a question from Deboshi Chakrabarti. As far as subaltern studies is concerned, it started its journey by pointing out the futility of having a singular objectivity and advocated for the multiple subjectivity. How in the last 3 decades this multiple subjectivity shrunk to singular subjectivity and became the singular objectivity? As a historian, how do you deconstruct the deconstruction?
I mean, I agree with the trajectory described there. I mean, but I think that, so there's one perspective on knowledge and on history, which says more or less that when a dissenting group gets its own journal, it's no longer a dissenting group. So it's now the establishment, and then it's in their vested interest to defend their position, to cement it, to find acolytes, to reproduce normal science in that way. So I guess that's one way of looking at it. But I think also, do we concede cultural to at least the South Asianist, cultural stability to at least the South Asianist post-colonial academics, and say that they are extremely concerned with maintaining social hierarchies? I think that would be conceding too much. I think this is really a question of whether you can read intention, and I'm always reluctant to read this, but I definitely think that institutions have reproduced certain rigid formalities, and that becomes all the more difficult to dissent from. I mean, if you're a young graduate student looking to get into an Ivy League school in the US, you will not be able to avoid one of the post-colonial dinosaurs, and they will make sure that you don't get in if you're not going to at least let them do their thing and maintain their position.
We have now a criticism from Barbara Lutti. Thanks for your talk. I'm a little astonished that you reduce post-colonial studies, which is obviously not a closed theoretical framework, to questions of identitarian questions and questions of clumsy victimhood. I think in political debates and sciences, people are eclectically using different concepts for different ends, not just ending up with one definite idea in mind. I find it a bit undifferentiated the way you argue, as if all post-colonial theorists think and work in the same direction. Would you like to?
Yes, I would. And I would like to invoke my favorite French theorists, Goscinny and Uderzo, and say no one knows where Alatia really is. By which I mean post-colonial theorists obviously don't all think and work in the same direction, but they also all disavow the label post-colonial theory. So if you find me one who's really quite exciting and eclectic and disrupts this understanding, then I'm willing to listen.
We have a question from our gosh, what is Martin's title in
Beauty director.
Thank you. I forgot the name in English for a second. Martin Schad asks, does the general direction of your analysis suggest one or the other position taken in the debate about Weltoffenheit, just to name the elephant in the room, Israel and anti-Semitism? Hello, Martin. Thank you for asking. Ben, I don't know how much you followed the debate around Weltoffenheit. Have you followed it? Shall I lay out?
I have heard bits of it, but if you'd like to lead me into it, then I can make sure that I'm getting it right.
So there has been a concern that because of certain voices in post-colonial studies, which put the state of Israel in a colonial history and do not distinguish the history and the founding of the state of Israel from, say, French or British or German colonialism, and so have a rather undifferentiated view of Israel as a colonial settler state. There is a concern among many people in Germany that you cannot both be an anti-colonialist and work against anti-Semitism. Yeah, I raised my eyebrows at that one too, and I appreciate your doing so, but there have been significant debates in the last half year around that question. I have taken a position saying I don't see the conflict. Of course, you can be anti-colonialist as well as anti-Semitic, since I view anti-Semitism as a form of racism. And, you know, historical differences are interesting, but they're not moral differences. So I have taken that position, but there are many people who are concerned that you cannot both fight racism and anti-Semitism, given certain post-colonial critiques of Israel.
I mean, I think it should be possible to accept a critique of Israel as a colonial settler state without being anti-Semitic. That's, for me, a reasonable position. I, therefore, don't feel called upon to make an argument for the reversal of history and the reconstruction of some pristine pre-colonial order either. But I think that that I have a prior disruption to this question, in the sense that I always felt rather annoyed at being called upon to answer questions about Israel and anti-Semitism or Israel and settler colonialism. My father comes from a Mizrahi family, which doesn't mean that I have anything to do with the state of Israel. I have been once. But what it also means is that we are very entangled in positions which all are supposed to impute a whole series of things if you accept one premise. And I think that I don't like the chain of being that comes through it. I actually tried to follow some of the debate around Mbembe, and I thought that it was not very enlightening. I think that both sides did not acquit themselves very well, which is an evasion of the question, I admit, but I don't think I know enough about it to give a clear reaction.
Well, let me, without going into all the Weltoffenheit debates, which were sparked, although not caused, by the debate around Membe. My own position is that Israel is an apartheid state, but that it doesn't mean that it's a settler colonialist state in the same sense that other colonial states have been. You're nodding, so I'm assuming that you may agree with this, but
I can see that position as perfectly reasonable. But I also think that all these labels, what do the labels do? They actually take the moral resonance of a term in one context and they transfer it to another context. I'll give you another example of this. There's this famous line in Césaire, which Fanon also picks up, where they say, well, you know, the Holocaust is so terrible only because it's Europeans doing things to Europeans. They've done this to Africans for years, right? And now that can be taken as an understanding that, you know, you should read violence in a colonial context as equally terrible. But in other respects, it's often taken as a way to relativize or minimize the historical impact of the Holocaust, or to give it less of a moral resonance, right? And I'm also not somebody who would say, well, you know, you can't compare the Holocaust with anything. If you haven't compared it, how do you know?
Exactly.
Yeah. So I think what happens is in all these contexts, again, as in the case of Conrad writing to a metropolitan audience about Africa, and being read by Achebe as insulting Africans, you're in danger of reading a fragment of a debate that has a very different resonance in one context, in another context. And even debates which are fundamentally, supposedly the same, like the fact that Germany must have a particular position on the state of Israel. And Israel must encourage Germany to have that particular position on the state of Israel. Even in these things where the two arguments seem to mesh in some ways and seem to be perfectly compatible, the change of context would give you very different resonances.
Ben, can I jump in as the Israeli in the room?
Yeah.
Almost the elephant, not quite, but the Israeli in the room, also to relate to Martin's question and to your answer. I think that one thing that needs to be mentioned here is that maybe is important to notice is how similar the argument of Zionism and the state of Israel is to an identitarian type of politics, to identity politics. That's, I think, the beginning. That's really the beginning of understanding the situation, because the argument is actually, for lack of a better term, identical. It is the universalism of the Enlightenment has failed us. It does not defend our lives. It did not defend our rights. This is why we need our own identity politics. And if you, as someone who is not one of us, criticize it, question it, you're a racist.
Yeah.
Now, once you take that position and you claim that those people are the Zionists, are themselves the colonialists, then what you get really is one type of anti-universalism against the other.
Yes.
And this is also why it's so violent, because it's all a game of power and identity, and there's basically no way to make, speak about what's legitimate and what's not. It's no longer in that field. I take it that's, so in a way, this plays out very well into your argument, because it shows precisely what a deadlock these type of discussions are.
Precisely.
Let me just say this, you can answer another very related remark from David Abraham. Would it not be fair to say that in the US, at least, the failure of universalism to bring equality to African Americans especially led to a shift from blindness toward particularity to enlightened consciousness of it?
I mean, in the best cases, I'm sure that's true. But I think that that would be in the best cases. I mean, I think I don't want to be one of these persons who has this view that I'm blind to all consciousness of race and difference. And I think in my talk, I made that clear.
Right.
I think I also wanted to say that I want to be alert to different forms and different dynamics which relate to difference. But I think that when you make the argument, then only we can understand ourselves. And everybody else might somehow approximate an understanding, but they don't really get us. Then you're actually excluding people. And even if you want to see that as an affirming argument, it's a politically self-defeating argument. It's the way a minority must remain a minority, and an oppressed people cannot seek allies because they don't actually make that jump outside of themselves. It's especially disastrous for structural minorities in large politics.
I have another question from someone who wants to remain anonymous. Coming back to the point raised on different brands of reason, the word brand itself assumes a hierarchy, question mark? I'm not sure that that's what it assumes. It assumes capitalism. Sorry, that's me. This is not the questioner. And the propensity for engaging in a Babel's curse kind of a moment. To what extent is it usable to situate this lack of open debate to a specific post-colonial moment? If the post-colonial voucher near flawlessly speaks the language of the colonial, anti-colonial entity, not always a race question, how useful is it to speak of a different rhetoric to combat a post-colonial insistence of difference? I'm thinking, for instance, of Feyerabend's opening lines of Against Method. Science is essentially an anarchic enterprise. One wonders if a substitution of the word anarchic with eclectic, which would have worked fine, would have earned him the same cancel culture label.
I don't remember reading Feyerabend that way or anybody else doing it. So I maybe I'm just missing the connection being made. But for the first half of that question, I think that I'm not sure whether we're referring literally to a language, as in the language of the colonial or anti-colonial entity being English, or a European language, or being in the register of. And I think the two are sometimes overlapping. How useful is it to speak of a different rhetoric to combat a post-colonial insistence of difference? It depends what the different rhetoric is. I think that if the post-colonial rhetoric is of difference, but if it is performed to the colonizer, post-colonizer, as a way of insisting on difference, then it's actually insisting on a comparator at all times. And I think many people have said that post-colonial in particular is continuously talking about colonialism and almost nothing else. So that may not be a useful thing to be doing. But a different rhetoric in the sense of how to build comparators and links to other arguments is probably something which I would aspire
to. Thank you. I have a final question. I'm wondering if Omri has a final question that you'd like to ask. Omri?
I said I'm listening. I'm
okay.
done.
Final question is just this. I certainly understand, given everything that you've said about post-colonial studies, why you want to turn from academic history to activism. I wonder if you'd tell us what kind of activism you think would be fruitful, you think is fruitful today.
I mean, almost nothing that I can think of to do now will earn me a living. So that's probably one starting disadvantage. But I think what I mean in terms of activism is actually to bring people dealing with the same problem or similar versions of the same problem in different parts of the world together. You can't be a historian of fascism without, to a certain extent, being active in trying to observe fascism in action today. I think also, when I started studying history, I actually had this mistaken belief that it was about bringing different subjectivities together so as to better understand the differences and therefore the communicating capabilities of these differences, rather than to separate them out. So I didn't believe that history was anybody's history, that the French Revolution wasn't a French history, nor was the Russian Revolution a Russian history. And certainly the fact that the Holocaust is now to be seen as merely German was not something that I would ever have dreamed. The fact that there's some special responsibility of Germans to remember the Holocaust and of Jews and Roma and Sinti and other victims, but not of humanity in general, would have been something puzzling to me then. But I think that I'm less naive now, and I know that forms of dissociation work psychoanalytically and historically.
Thank you very much, Ben. This has been a wonderful conversation, and I very much look forward to post-pandemic days and discussing this further. Maybe you can hold up your book, which I'm about to order,
Okay.
which may interest other people.
Not this one, the other one, right?
Yeah. The
This is the anti-national book.
Okay.
And this is the one I referred to.
After the last post. Okay, very much looking forward to reading and hopefully to discussing with you. Thanks to all of our guests for tuning in and listening. The next virtual Einstein event will take place on this coming Tuesday, April 27th, with Daniela Dahn. Title is Alle Macht den Medien, die Umdeutung der 89er Revolution. Das wird auf Deutsch stattfinden. I know that Daniela is going to be talking about the ways in which the West German media constructed an account of the 89 revolution in the DDR that isn't, shall we say, accurate to those who were actually, to describe what happened from the perspective of those who actually were involved in that revolution. And we'll be talking about that this coming Tuesday. Thank you once again, Ben.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It was a great pleasure.